Hi, I'm Tom, and this is Why Do Men, the podcast exploring male behaviour in dating and relationships. From the evolution of dating apps, online dating, right through to trends like ghosting and catfishing, differing relationship types like E&M and polyamory, it's never been more confusing to find love and healthy relationships. Each episode is going to feature a special guest as we try to figure out why do men. Welcome to Why Do Men, the podcast exploring male behaviour in dating and relationships. For this episode, we're going to look at something which is incredibly prevalent in modern relationships, jealousy. To join me today, I've got Dr. Mark Rackley. Mark is an expert in male mental health, relationships and emotional intelligence. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Tom.
It's really good to see you. Thanks for connecting. We were chatting on Instagram for a little bit.
Yes. Thank you for bringing me on.
You're welcome. Jealousy.
Yeah.
Really broad topic.
Yeah.
I've got a load of notes around this. And funnily enough, we were speaking with the crew beforehand who all have very, very different points of view on jealousy. I wanted to kick off by asking, as an emotion, is jealousy a healthy emotion?
It's informative. I think with the emotion of jealousy, it's how you understand it and how you deal with it. Like basically all the emotions really. And I suppose it can be helpful in terms of generating self-awareness around what goes on for you and how you understand yourself and how jealousy is something you experience. Because thinking about all your emotions is there, which is why they're so important, that's why we have them, is they're vital bits of information. They're informing you about the world and they're informing you about how you understand the world. So in that sense, your emotions are always really, really helpful. Now with jealousy, it's not necessarily a problem emotion in terms of that it's going to cause you problems in your life.
Yeah.
But if you don't understand it and you don't manage it and you don't work with it, then it can cause massive problems. So it's a little bit like anger.
Yeah.
Anger is usually beneficial, but it gets a lot of bad press. And jealousy can help you in terms of, like I said, understanding things. But if you don't do the work, then like all the emotions, they'll work on you. And that's dangerous.
And I mean, we had a debate before the show started rolling about jealousy because people experience it first in different ways and secondly to different levels of severity, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And I wouldn't describe myself as a jealous person, but I don't know if that's a good thing or not. What are the sort of triggers for jealousy normally?
We'd be here all day.
Right.
If I was to jump into that. They're vast, Tom. Like, jealousy is not something you're born with. It's one of those things that you start to feel as you live. So kind of from the very early stages of life, if you're, say, an only child, and then this little person arrives in the world, you get a sibling, then what you can feel is jealousy, which is, it's about, well, I don't like that and I don't like the change, and this change is not positive change, it's negative change, and it's making me feel insecure and it's making me feel scared. So that's when the jealousy can actually start from a very young age, which is that we start to understand the limits of the world, that we're not the center of the universe, we don't get the attention all the time, that we do share the world, that there's going to be people in the world that are going to do things better than us and that are going to get more attention than us. And so what we're learning is the boundaries of life and the limits of humanity. So jealousy is a normal thing to feel because we're feeling threatened and scared. But again, like if you don't manage it, then it can be something that will literally stay with you your whole life. Right. So it can travel with you from childhood into adolescence and then into adulthood. So by the time we kind of get to adulthood, we could have had a problem with jealousy our whole life.
Right.
Which means that when we get into relationships, our issue with jealousy has predated that person we end up in a relationship with.
And would you normally say that, I mean, let's talk about jealousy in the context of romantic relationships, right? Because that's probably the context in which it shows up the most.
Yeah.
Is it normally childhood triggers which end up manifesting themselves with that kind of jealousy? Or is it actually romantic triggers in the early stages of your life, which then you think, right, I've been hurt before, therefore I don't trust this person anymore.
It can be lots of things, Tom. I know it probably sounds super flaky, but that's the problem with the brain, is it's never one thing.
Yeah.
It can be a load of different things. So some of the sources of jealousy can be learned behavior. So if you witnessed in your family, say, where one of the caregivers of the parents was a very jealous person and didn't check it, so what the child can learn as well, that's a way to deal with the world, is to actually display jealous feelings and try to control a situation that you feel is threatening. It can also to do with attachment. So depending on the attachment style, which again, the thing about attachment is we have no control over attachment. We're at the mercy of the people who either decide to attach to us or not.
Right.
So if we have an insecure attachment or avoidant, then we're going to be a bit distrustful of people. We're going to be careful.
Yeah.
So that's where jealousy can kind of take hold, which is we're already suspicious. We're already slightly paranoid about the fact that, well, my experience in life is that people let me down, or people leave me, or people don't care for me. So there'll be more of a vulnerability to jealousy based off of that attachment style. And like anything, it'll play out in your relationships. So it won't just play out in your adult relationships. It'll play out in teenage relationships, in your relationship with your family, in your relationship with your bosses. One final point I'd make is sometimes, and I'm not blaming parents here, but sometimes the parents can play the kids off each other.
Right.
And there can be sibling rivalry with the parents saying, well, why can't you be more like your brother?
Yeah.
Or why can't you be more like your sister? So what you're actually creating there is you're creating tension between the siblings, but the jealousy can arise in the sibling that's made to feel you're not good enough.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is a podcast about male behavior.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the differences between male jealousy and female jealousy, because I have a hypothesis. I'm not an expert. You are, fortunately. And I have a hypothesis that social conditioning around men and these traditional masculine tropes might play a part in male jealousy in relationships, where men are maybe raised to believe that they're meant to be strong and protective, and almost there's an element of ownership over their partner. Do you think that plays into it?
Totally. The unfortunate thing with jealousy, Tom, is the impact of the jealous behaviour is lost on the person who's jealous. Yeah. So they're not thinking, what's this doing to this other person? What impact is this having on them? When they're not thinking about the awful stress and anxiety it might be causing the person that they're displaying these jealous behaviours towards. Yeah. And again, the reason for that again can be lots of things, but you're spot on. If the guy thinks, well, that's my woman, right? So kind of really kind of territorial, absolutely. Then they start to objectify, but also that's where the idea of again possessiveness comes in. Yeah. So if you break that word down, that's about thinking this person's a possession. They're not. Yeah. They're their own person. Absolutely. And so that's lost on the guy, but also, unfortunately, with some of the more toxic masculinity behavior, then the narrative in that is that you've got to be the alpha male. I hate that word. I hate that word. Yeah. And so therefore then you're the guy who's always on top, always winning, gets the girl. And so this mentality is a breeding ground for jealousy. Because again, you're not going to view your partner as an independent woman in her own right. Yeah. She's an extension of you. Absolutely. And she's not.
So you just spoke a little bit about that possessiveness and in heterosexual relationships specifically, right? Where a man might feel an element of possessiveness. I suppose the flip side, or one of the kind of positives in a way around that is, and we spoke about this with the crew earlier, that the women in that relationship might feel that possessiveness is a good thing to an extent because they feel protected or feel an element of security around that. Like, could that ever be viewed as a positive?
Yeah. So I suppose with that, that's about creating a secure relationship, that the woman feels secure and also that she feels that the guy has her back. Yeah. So absolutely that can feel that you're in a supportive relationship, that the person is available for you and is is trying to protect you.
Yeah.
So absolutely, they're all positives. They really, really are. But with jealousy, it closes it down. So if you think about that type of relationship you just mentioned there, Tom, that creates space. That creates space for the woman to be able to speak her mind, live her own life, make her own choices. That she's very much she's a free agent in the relationship. But jealousy closes that down. So jealousy restricts the freedom of the woman. It restricts her freedom of choice. It restricts her, again, in extreme cases of jealousy, like who you can talk to, like what you can wear. Like and what that does then is that's not then a healthy relationship, because the person who's jealous is now controlling the other person, but they're controlling the other person because they feel threatened from their own mind, not because the person's actually doing that. It's a perception of what is going on. So the controlling behavior is to try to stop what they imagine is something bad happening.
And we talked a little bit about childhood triggers, comparison between siblings, parental pressure. I imagine there are a wealth of other factors, but previous romantic relationships and the impact of those relationships breaking down in a negative way, I presume will have a huge impact on jealousy. And the example I give is like, say if you've been cheated on by an ex-partner in the past, you're always going to have that fear of that happening again.
Yeah, absolutely, because that'll scare you. So if somebody's cheated on you, then of course, like, that's going to massively affect your trust in people. But also, it instead of something being that could happen, because sometimes with jealousy, that the person being cheated on hasn't happened. It's what they imagine could happen.
Right.
But if you have been cheated on, then you've lived that reality. So that kind of worst case scenario is now real. So if that happens, and you got to deal with that, because that's going to create obviously an emotional response. It's going to be quite traumatizing, and roughly there's nothing set in stone here, but it takes about 6 months, we reckon, for the real kind of trauma of being cheated on to settle.
Wow.
So for a while, you're going to feel a bit rubbish. And there's no getting away from that. But if you navigate that and manage it, which is why rebound relationships are a massive issue, then you
don't think they're a positive?
Well, you don't heal.
Yeah. This is a great separate episode almost, Because I could not name you a single friend of mine that hasn't had a rebound relationship post a big breakup. And I always thought there was an element of positivity in rebounds, because at least there's an element of soothing and finding comfort and intimacy through another partner. But is that something you disagree with?
I think you need to be very careful with a rebound relationship, because if it's been particularly brutal breakup or somebody's cheated on you, then that's going to have psychological fallout. Like, that's a given.
Yeah.
And that's going to have emotional fallout. So if you don't process that, then, and the brain is hardwired to process situations, to understand it, and so therefore we can take the learning and move on and deal with things differently going forward. But if you don't deal with that, then it stays unprocessed, which means then that unprocessed stuff can play itself out in the next relationship.
Got you.
Because you've not dealt with it. The brain hasn't separated it through the processing. Yeah,
right. So you carry on just displaying those patterns over and over again rather than really working through it. How would I work through it?
So that takes some self-awareness in terms of, and this is where it gets tricky, because if you've been cheated on, a relationship has ended badly for you, then that's not going to feel nice. It's going to bring up lots of very difficult emotions and feelings, and it's going to be disruptive, and it's going to make you feel vulnerable, and it's going to make you feel weak, and also you're not going to feel psychologically strong. So we don't tend to run into those spaces in life. We try and avoid them. But if that's what's going on, then we need to work through that to get stronger. If we're in places where we're vulnerable and then we don't manage that vulnerability, then we actually stay vulnerable because we learn no skills of how to actually say, this is how I'm feeling, or we don't learn to create a different story in our heads and narratives around what happened. So we're more prone then to just repeating patterns of behavior because we haven't allowed ourselves, and it is about giving yourself permission and making a choice. We haven't allowed ourselves to actually deal with how vulnerable we feel and to allow other people to support us in order to get through that.
And I hear this, I mean, it's one of the probably the three major outtakes that I've taken from my own therapeutic practice is like allow yourself to sit in some of those negative, tricky feelings.
Yeah.
But I think that is easier said than done.
Oh, it's awful.
And it's incredibly uncomfortable, right?
Because
you almost have to meet yourself. And sometimes you don't like the version of yourself that you're meeting. But, you know, there's one thing, I think, being aware of those feelings. And then there's another thing entirely, which is about changing that behavior.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, my perspective on that would be like, I've always needed a third party, someone like you to help guide me through that. But for people that don't have access to those kind of resources, like, is there any way that you can sort of start working through that stuff yourself if you don't have external resources to help you?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you don't always need a psychologist or a professional. Like, and this is where, again, I think that the bigger conversation around men talking comes in, which is like, if you've got a trusted friend or you've got a network or mates that you can be open with, and they allow you to be open, and you can, instead of your mate going for kind of, well, let's just shut the conversation down or find a solution, but you can just say how,
have a beer.
Just say how you feel.
Yeah,
like I'm feeling rubbish. I'm sad. Then just giving yourself permission to say that, then that shifts it in your head because you're no longer kind of holding on to all of that, which is going to put pressure on your brain. That releases that. Yeah. And it allows then your brain to recalibrate by getting those feelings and emotions out. So talking. Yeah. Like talking to your friends if you have them, or find a community that allows you to talk. Yeah. And that is not going to judge you for how you feel, because that's sadly a big fear that men have is I'm going to be judged if I say I'm sad or if I say I'm scared, but they're normal feelings to feel. Like we feel those for a reason. Yeah. But if you're not connecting with those feelings, or you feel you've got to bottle them or repress them, then that's a problem.
Just one final question I wanted to ask you around the triggers of jealousy before we get into some of the other solutions. But they're in the modern day, right? We have access to so much information, and that's incredible at times, right? It's empowering. But one of my other thoughts before we shot this episode was, well, things like social media, for example, like presumably platforms like that exacerbate jealousy, because in a romantic context, you can see everything that your partner's doing, and that's not always a good thing. But more importantly, you can see the hot girl that your boyfriend's just liked on Instagram, or you know, the guy that she's out partying with. Like, do you see in your practice that sort of really exacerbated some of those negative emotions?
It can do. So jealousy is very closely linked to insecurity. Right. But insecurities are personal. So what makes me feel insecure will maybe not make you feel insecure. Right. They'll be personal to us, but we all have them. And the reason we all have insecurities is because nobody has all the gifts. Like we are going to meet the limits of our own experience and our own understanding. So I think it's very important to recognize that you're going to feel insecure, and your insecurity is going to be triggered, but that's your stuff. Yeah. Like, if you project that insecurity onto somebody else, then that's when you become jealous. Because now, instead of that being a me problem, I now make it a you problem. Yeah. So I'm not dealing with myself.
Right. So it's quite a sort of selfish pursuit in a way, because you're expecting that person to take your own shit.
Absolutely. But it is selfish because, again, come back to what we were saying earlier. If you were to stop and think, what is my jealous behavior doing to this other person? Then you wouldn't do it. Yeah. Because there's nothing positive in it for them. Like, they're miserable. Like, the person who's on the receiving end of jealous behavior if you're to ask them, like, how is this for you?
Yeah.
They're never going to say, I'll keep doing it. This is great.
Right.
Like, I'm having the best time here.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, they're going to say, this is awful.
Sure.
So it is selfish because you're not thinking about anybody else but yourself. Because if you did, you wouldn't do it.
Absolutely. I wanted to go on to some questions. Had quite a lot of questions from the guys that follow me on Instagram. Wanted to ask you a question from my own perspective first, personally, because, like I said, jealousy isn't an emotion which I identify with that strongly, but I don't know if that's a good thing or not. It's the same as anger. I had an amazing life coach called Michelle Ellman on our first episode, and I was like, why don't I ever feel angry? And I'm not sure that's a good thing necessarily. Maybe I don't let myself feel like that. And I think the jealousy stuff is linked to attachment, which you spoke about earlier, because traditionally I've been very avoidant, you know, had quite a lot of rejection and abandonment as a kid. And so I don't know whether that's me or whether that manifests itself in my adult relationships where I'm like, I'm just going to play it cool, right? You can do whatever you want because it doesn't really matter to me, you know? Yeah. I'm not allowing myself to really feel wholeheartedly with my romantic partners.
Yeah. That's what you just described. I'm sorry if this sounds textbook.
No, I love textbook.
But it kind of is, which is like, that's kind of classic avoidant behavior. Which is, I'm independent, nothing to see here, you can't hurt me. So the reason I'm not putting you on the couch here.
Oh no, I'm on the couch right now, Mark. I'm here.
I'm obviously not your doctor. But just in terms of like, the links, which is you won't feel jealous because you won't allow yourself to fully attach to get hurt. Yeah. Right.
And a big part of that is about not being willing to show my own weakness to a partner.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it was another question that I wanted to ask you, leads quite nicely on, was we spoke about some of the things that you can do to counteract or help yourself through those negative emotions. Yeah. And admitting that to your partner might be a really good way of doing that. But I can imagine for a lot of men, like it's quite an ugly thing to admit. Like I saw you were out with your mates yesterday and it made me feel really insecure.
Yeah.
Like what's the best way of navigating a conversation like that?
That's a fantastic question. And it's so important because that's about ownership.
Right.
And the first place to go to with the recognition of jealousy is you got to own it.
Yeah.
You got to own it. This is my stuff. And once you own it, then you can bring it to the other person and say, like, this is what's happening for me. But if you don't own it, then you'll project it. So you'll be like, this is, well, you're making me feel like this.
Yeah,
oh,
right.
No,
right,
not
right,
actually. So you got to own it.
Yeah.
So, and I get what what you said is spot on, Tom, which is like that in order to do that, that takes a lot of humility, and it also takes an awful lot of vulnerability, because what you're disclosing isn't nice. And you're not disclosing a particularly nice aspect of your character or personality.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot to do that, because of course, if we're going to be that open, then it's, how's that going to land? Because I'm not going to look good here.
Exactly.
And I want to look good.
Honestly. And I mean, everyone says, like, I want a guy that's emotionally expressive and vulnerable, but no woman is saying, I want a guy that says, I'm really fucking jealous and I don't want you going out with your friends.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there is a limit to it. And this is about, I suppose, language and how you communicate.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's an element of like, you do still want to protect yourself. No matter how secure you are, you're never going to want to fully admit that flaw.
Yeah. True. But if you're in a healthy relationship that is independent, that allows communication, and I often say to my patient, this is the kind of the test of a relationship, really. Yeah. It's easy to have the easy conversations. They're a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But how does a relationship cope when you have to have the hard conversations? Does it even allow space for the hard conversations? And if it does, then that's a brilliant relationship, because then you can communicate the stuff like, listen, I'm struggling with jealousy.
Right.
But once it's allowed to be spoken about, then you can deal with it as a couple. And it can be properly managed. And also, why that is so brilliant is because that builds the trust.
Yeah.
Not talking about it actually harms the trust.
Yeah.
Because now you're guessing and you're mind reading and you're trying to get inside the other person's head, but you're not talking about it.
Yeah.
So it can be harder to talk about it, absolutely. But in terms of being able to use that effectively to benefit the relationship, it's so much better.
And this was another thing I wanted to ask you about. I have this hypothesis that maybe the reason why I haven't felt jealousy, in spite of having, quite a tricky childhood with a lot of triggers, maybe that's because the partners that I've found have all been incredibly secure. And maybe I've just been lucky, But one of my other questions was going to be, do you think that having different types of romantic partners can have an impact on the level of jealousy you feel?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Because think about a relationship, it's two people coming together who then create that relationship. So it's its own unique creation, but they both have their own attachment styles. They both have their own history, and that's going to get played out. Yeah. So if you're with a secure partner, then that's brilliant, because if she's secure, then she's okay with you being independent. She's okay with you living your own life.
She's okay with me saying I need a week out of any sort of formal conversation because I just need a bit of a time out.
Yeah. Because her experience is, well, that's all right.
Yeah.
That's not threatening.
Exactly.
I'm not going to be abandoned. And the thing about a secure attachment too is, even if the person is to leave you, I'm going to be all right. Like somebody who has an avoidant or an insecure attachment is, I'm not going to be okay here, because that's been their experience, which is, again, in the early stages, that it wasn't okay at that early stage of your life. But again, if you're carrying those wounds and you haven't healed them, then again, they will just play out. So even if the person is secure and is saying to you, listen, you're safe here, if you haven't worked on yourself and actually allowed yourself to feel safe, then you could actually wreck that relationship. That could be sabotaged, and it will all be your stuff.
Okay. Couple of audience questions. So the first one...
Agony uncle, huh?
Yeah, let's absolutely. Absolutely. The first one was from a woman who says, my boyfriend gets jealous when I go out with my friends.
Right.
But he says it's because he cares. Is there an element of truth in that?
No.
Okay.
No. That's not about caring. That's his stuff. That's his insecurity. That's his jealousy. This is the thing with jealousy. It can, if you don't, again, the guy, if he doesn't own it, and if he doesn't accept why this is happening, then it'll be spun as a positive. But that's not a positive. The jealousy is not because he cares. The jealousy is because he's scared.
Yeah.
Because if he wasn't scared, then he wouldn't be jealous. Remember, it's a reaction. It's an emotional reaction. So if he wasn't scared, if he didn't feel threatened by you going out, then he wouldn't feel jealous.
Do you think there's a difference between jealousy being a personal issue versus jealousy being a relationship issue?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Because the thing about jealousy is jealousy can happen in loads of different areas of life. So jealousy can be to do with things like, if we went to, say, a competitive school, then we can be jealous of our classmates because they're getting better grades than us. It can be, you see it a lot in sport, that the jealousy around other people on the team getting picked or being better than you. And you see it in business. Businesses will foster jealousy between the colleagues because they want them to be more productive. And
it encourages competition.
Absolutely.
So that's not a particularly healthy way of going about business, huh?
No. So it can be something the person has had for a long time, but also that in the different areas of their life, it's being played out, and now it gets played out in the relationship.
Final segment of the episode is about some proactive tips, advice for people in terms of how to deal with this kind of stuff. Cool. Right. So the first question I wanted to ask you about was around boundary setting and how you might even go about that if you have a partner that you think is jealous. Yeah.
Boundaries are vital, because boundaries let you know the parameters of what's healthy. And that's the key part here, Tom, is some people see boundaries as threatening because they don't like it. They see them as, well, they're dangerous because I'm being controlled.
Right.
No. Boundaries are healthy, because boundaries allow both people to say, well, I'm okay with this and I'm okay with this. So it gives you freedom, it gives you independence. But in order to, it might sound a little bit kind of opposite, but in order to understand the boundaries, you have to understand your limits. So what are my limits in terms of what things trigger my jealousy?
Right.
What things do I find is my stuff? So like you said about the person, if you're going out with the girls,
Yeah.
then is that one of my triggers?
Yes.
Or if you're friends with an ex, does that trigger me? Or if you're going away for the weekend or wherever it might be, then is that a trigger for me? So if you understand the triggers, then you can manage the boundaries around, okay, well, if you're, say, out with the girls, I'm not going to contact you because I'm going to do that work on myself, even if I find it really uncomfortable to actually manage that situation. So the boundaries allow for the work to be done within the relationship.
And this is obviously in the context of the protagonist, the person feeling jealous. But, I suppose there's the other side of the coin, which is like, if you are someone who's in a relationship with someone who feels quite jealous and controlling, like, how do you go about setting boundaries? And also, how do you know when boundaries have been crossed? And maybe that's something that you need to move away from that relationship.
You might do. Yeah, you might do. Because if the other person isn't willing to respect your boundaries, or if they want to keep squeezing the boundaries where it's not healthy for you because you're feeling controlled, the other person isn't giving you the freedom that you need in that relationship, then that person's issue with jealousy is going to destabilize that relationship. So again, if they're not willing to work on it and own it, then you might have to think about, well, can I be in this relationship with this person?
Absolutely. We talked about childhood triggers, all of that kind of stuff, I wouldn't describe myself as the most enlightened man, but I've got an okay understanding of where a lot of my negative behaviour comes from. That reflection, where do you even start if you're new to this whole world of being more mindful, self-improvement, understanding yourself a bit better? Any books, anything that you've read that you might recommend?
Yeah, loads.
Your own?
Well, I was going to say, I have an episode on jealousy on my podcast.
Right, brilliant.
So episode 9 is on jealousy. I have issues. That's my podcast. But educate yourself. Like, the thing, when it comes to this stuff, it's really important to normalize it. So if you feel jealous, that doesn't mean that you're some kind of horrible narcissist that's going to be alone for the rest of their life. No, like, educating yourself around the why, like so what's going on in my head, what's being played out, what things are affecting me. So in order to do that, you have to allow yourself to reflect, to let your self-awareness grow, which means you got to educate yourself. So like the books, podcasts, but just even talking to people or listening to this, just something that might trigger you to help you to actually reflect on yourself. Because without doing that work, then you're not going to grow. You'll just keep repeating things because the brain isn't getting any new knowledge and you're not learning about yourself. So it is really important. Like, it's okay to say, like, I don't know where to start, or I don't know myself very well. That's fine. Or if you need to, just go to therapy. Like, sit in a space where somebody's going to open up your head and help you understand yourself better.
If I could offer my own personal reflection on that, it was about patterns and like noticing patterns in my behaviour. Like, I remember when I broke up with my long-term partner and I was 32, 33, and went through 3 or 4 years of dating people and like having really intense relationships, 2 or 3 months, and then breaking up and being like, I'm not meeting the right person. And then eventually you're like, they're not the problem, it's me that's the problem. And it's just little things like that, moments of realization, I suppose. So.
But it takes a lot of honesty, and also it takes a lot of accepting the fact that, this is me.
Being absolutely petrified of dying alone. I've worked through that now.
Good.
So, exactly. Totally cool with it. We spoke just before we started shooting about the relationship between jealousy and perfectionism, and you had some really interesting points of view on that. So I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on that.
So that might seem like an odd link for perfectionism and jealousy. But somebody who has an issue with perfectionism has a fear of failure. So they have a chronic fear of not being good enough, of other people succeeding, where they imagine that they've failed. So they hold themselves to very high standards, and also they don't allow for the the weaknesses of themselves. So where that can play itself out in jealousy is that person can't have a failed relationship.
Right.
That relationship has got to succeed. So it's about their ego. So I'm going to look bad if you leave me. I'm going to look bad if you find another guy attractive, or if another guy flirts with you, I'm going to look bad. So it's all selfish. So in that perfectionist ideal, then that person cannot tolerate in any way any form of failure or weakness. So what they'll do is they'll perceive somebody behaving in that way as a reflection on them.
Yeah, right.
So with perfectionism then, that they will hold the partner also to perfectionist standards, which means then again that the partner cannot behave in a way that the person with the perfectionist mindsets feels, well, no, that's not what we do. You can't behave like that.
You have to behave in a way which my idealistic brain tells me is the right way to behave as a romantic partner.
Absolutely, because again, it's a reflection on them.
And that might be things like you're not allowed to speak to another guy when we're out together.
It goes even further, which is lose weight.
Right.
You can't look like that.
Wow.
You've got to be the smartest woman in the room.
Yeah.
The woman that's earning all the money, the woman that has it all together. So it doesn't allow the woman to be her own person, and it holds the woman into crazy standards that are being placed on her by her partner.
Right. There was something you said there which I found really interesting, and that was around those idealistic standards that you might have for your partner. And that kind of fed into envy to me as well, right?
Yes.
Where it's like, if you're dating with someone who, particularly as a guy, when there's probably a bit of pressure traditionally, societally, to provide, to earn more money, hit all those traditional masculine archetypes. If you're dating someone that maybe earns more money than you, comes from a more successful family, maybe has a better job, does that feed jealousy? Is that more envy?
That's more envy. So envy is more external. It's about the fact that somebody else has something that you want.
Right.
So it is more of an external reality, whereas jealousy is about perception.
Yeah.
So I can be jealous because I'm perceiving that I'm going to lose something, because jealousy is closely associated with loss. So I'm going to lose face, I'm going to lose ego, I'm going to lose pride, I'm going to lose some kind of status. So it's very personal and it's very internal. Whereas envy, there's something objective with envy, which is to do, well, I'm envious of that person. It's a promotion, it's a car, it's a house, it's a bank account. So it is more about the fact that somebody else has something you want.
Yeah. So it's a want or a desire as opposed to an internal reaction.
Yeah. But they are closely linked.
Yeah. And what about other sort of negative emotions that you might associate with jealousy? I think we've established now that it's very rarely positive, right?
It's never positive.
Does jealousy breed right? Well, exactly. That's my job. I was a PR man. But does jealousy breed any other sort of negative reactions in people?
Yeah, the thing about your brain is it's a network, and the network goes everywhere. So that's why feelings trigger feelings, and emotions trigger emotions.
Yeah.
So with jealousy is very closely associated with other feelings like fear, sadness, and anger. So probably the most dangerous one of those is obviously anger, because anger's a very important emotion, actually, and it's one of the ones actually we're born with anger. So it's hardwired into the brain.
Right.
And the reason we need to feel anger, because anger tells us when something's not right. It tells us that no, that's wrong. And if we've been the victim of injustice, then anger is the appropriate response to help us then to deal with that situation. But if we have jealousy, which is kind of again about us and perception of loss, and then we start to feel, well, I'm being victimized here, that other person is making me feel bad, is making me feel unwanted or unloved, then we can perceive there's an injustice happening here. And then what we respond with is then it's anger, which is you're making me feel like this. You're making me feel insecure or bad, or you're making me look bad.
Yeah.
So if that gets triggered then and we don't manage the anger, then the anger then can spill over. Like it's anger, unfortunately, if you don't get a handle on it, it holds too much energy that it can become destructive.
Right.
So we start to self-destruct. And that's when we can get into behaviors which are really, really nasty when it comes to coercive control, domestic violence, and sadly, in some cases, death.
Yeah. I mean, we touched on this earlier, but I think that jealousy can often be the root cause of far more extreme behavior.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's the only emotion, reaction, but I mean, we've seen it in the press recently. And it seems to be the root cause for a lot of male on female violence. Yeah.
It comes back to what we were talking about earlier. If you don't get a handle on the jealousy, then you're leaving yourself in a very vulnerable state to having then to deal with all the associated emotions with it.
Yeah.
So if you can't handle your jealousy and it tips into anger, then you're now having to deal with two really powerful emotions that are going to affect how you think and affect how you behave.
Yeah.
So if you don't work on the jealousy, then you're literally at the mercy then of what comes along with it. And that's when jealousy can become really, really dangerous.
And I mean, you touched on a phrase which I see a lot in the press now around coercion, coercive control.
Yeah.
And my view is that pattern can often start with something which feels quite soft and subtle, and then over time grows into something quite visceral. And I suppose my question is, if you're someone that feels like you might be on the end of that, or the warning signs are there, like what do you do about it? Like how do you spot it? How do you get out of it?
It can be very subtle, because jealousy is fascinating, because jealousy is all about saving something. It's about preventing loss.
Now, for yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the perception that this other person's going to leave me, or I'm going to, like I said, lose ego.
Wow.
But bizarrely enough, the behaviors the person uses, i.e. coercive control, they're not going to be the things that are going to save your relationship.
No, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah. But that's lost on the person who's jealous, because they're not thinking clearly.
Yeah.
They're not thinking about, well, how's this other person going to feel? Are they going to want to stay with me if I'm checking their phone the whole time?
Yeah.
Or if I'm tracking them? So again, because it's very selfish. So if you are on the receiving end of that, and if you notice, or I always say to my patients, what are your friends saying? What are your family saying? Because they don't have an agenda. Their agenda is you.
Yeah.
And your well-being. And if they're saying, listen, I'm not sure about that, or they're picking up on things, listen to that. Because the person who's using coercive control or is jealous, they're not necessarily going to be blatant with their agenda.
Yeah.
Because again, that's not something they're going to expose or want to tell you, because they've not figured that out for themselves, not working on it. So they can spin it, like you said earlier, about, well, it's only because I care. But that's not what caring looks like. Caring isn't control.
Yeah.
Caring is freedom. It's respect. It's about allowing the other person to be themselves.
Yeah.
Like controlling another person, like that's not care.
Right. Exactly that. And do you think that there are any conditions, triggers, factors which influence people when they're receiving that behaviour, either rejecting it or being willing to accept it?
Yeah, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier about kind of attachment. If you've got two people, say, who have very poor attachment styles, then sadly what that can allow is the toleration of bad behaviour.
Right.
Because that's what they've witnessed and that's all they've known.
And also that it's that fear of being alone, right?
Exactly. Where I'd rather be in a bad relationship,
but
at least I have a person, than be by myself.
I see this all the time. I mean, this is a bigger thing than just jealousy and coercion, right?
Totally, yeah.
I say particularly for people in my generation where life is really hard, and it's a lot harder when you're on your own. But I think you meet this sort of tipping point whereby externally, you talk a really good point around friends and family, where I sit with a few of my friends where I'm like, externally, unbiased view, I think this relationship's making you less happy than trying to be by yourself. But it's that tipping point, and I think a lot of the time people don't realise they've gone past that point.
It's true. It's so true. And that can be sadly where like things have gone too far.
Yeah.
And things like, it's like lots of things, isn't it? Where sometimes we only deal with situations when we're in a crisis.
Absolutely.
And if it's not so bad or it feels bearable or we can tolerate it, then we put up with it.
Yeah.
But it's only like when it tips. And even sometimes when it tips, like say if there is domestic violence, that sometimes, and this is tragic, like that's not enough.
Right, exactly. And imagine a situation where you need the thing to be bigger than violence. I mean, that's a scary place to be in.
And that's the other bit, which is where jealousy can bring you, is that's where you can end up in a codependent relationship.
Right.
And they are bad.
Is there a situation where both, I mean, we're speaking about this, and it feels like we're speaking about this purely from a one-sided point of view, normally the guy, but is there a situation whereby both parties can be equally jealous of each other?
Absolutely.
And that contributes to the codependence?
Totally, yeah,
right.
Totally. Because if you have two insecure people who haven't managed their insecurities, and so how they manage things is control.
Yeah.
So they need control to feel safe. Therefore, then that plays out, which is both parties are controlling each other.
Yeah.
Because that's the only way they feel safe.
Wow.
Dangerous.
Absolutely.
Definitely not healthy. We would not encourage that.
Jesus. Anything else? I think that was the best bit. I'm really pleased we got that stuck. Yeah? Happy?